Thank you all for coming. One of the problems with writing a book like this, I didn't sort of anticipate this. It's that when people meet me who know I've written this, they say, "You better be sparkling." And I hadn't really thought that would happen. I was too dumb to realize what I was letting myself in for. Sometimes they say, "Oh my God, I've got to be sparkling." And I say, that's the other, more nervous reaction. But so I don't know if I'm going to sparkle, but I'll try to smolder a little bit for you. What I'm going to do is sort of amble and ramble a little bit, and I'm going to read some sections from the book. I'm going to try not to make this part of things too long, because one of the points of the book, and I hope of gatherings like this, which I've had before, is to have some back and forth. So hope to have some questions later on. When I got to Little Rock, I've never been in Arkansas before, to say nothing of Little Rock. I mean, I guess if I haven't been to Arkansas, it follows that I haven't been to Little Rock, but I'm a very provincial northeasterner. And every time I go somewhere, I find out that there's a lot going on in the world, more and more sort of decentralized culture and interest and activity and good things happening. And certainly since I've been here, I've been most impressed with the school and the library that I've seen. Kind enough to get a tour today, and I'm going to try to boost your local economy by sending people down here and telling them they really have got to see this. You don't have to show up when they come, but on the way in from the airport in the cab, not being so ignorant of my surroundings, I said to the cab driver, "About how long will it take to get to the hotel?" I didn't realize that was funny, but I guess I had no idea. That's not the thing that's supposed to get the laugh. Just the next thing. So hold back for a minute. So he said, 10 or 15 minutes. Now I've realized, driving around to one thing or another with Nikolai and other people here, that everything is 10 or 15 minutes away. And sometimes people say 12 minutes, and they're sort of more exact. That's an interesting local fact that I'm going to take home with me. The cab driver said, I don't know, about 12 minutes. And then there was a silence, and he said, "Not long enough." And I thought, that's good. Not long enough for him. I mean, clearly, he wanted it to be longer, and who could blame him? This is his living that he's making. And then I began to think later on that if everything is 10 or 12 minutes away, unlike, say, London or New York, then the cab drivers are always restricted to that kind of fare. But that was a very impudent thing for him to say, in the best sense of the term. He took a chance with the passenger. He thought, he kind of just said to himself, I hope this guy has a sense of humor, because he took this chance of sort of confiding. It was a confidence that he gave me, that he was trying to make a living. The economy is tough, and it sort of jump-started our conversation very quickly. And I said, well, it's plenty long enough for me. And we had a laugh, and we talked back and forth for a while. And we're not going to know each other or see each other, but it was a wonderful moment of a kind of human-to-human contact and a confession on his part that he has trouble, like the rest of us, economic troubles. So it doesn't always work that way when you take a chance conversationally, as he did. I was in Hilton Head visiting my in-laws a couple Christmases ago. My son gave my father-in-law a copy of Doris Kearns Goodwin's book about Lincoln, Team of Rivals. And her previous book had gotten her in trouble for plagiarism. I think it was called the Fitzgerald. Now I'm going to look down. I'm going to give up. It's called The Fitzgeralds and the Kennedys, and she was accused of plagiarizing stuff. So when my son gave my father-in-law this book that he knew that he wanted, my father-in-law said, "Oh, that's great. thank you, this is just what I wanted. And I said, being an ironic New Yorker, yeah, and she wrote this one herself. And a hush fell over the table. And I realized that my impudence, my mother-in-law quietly said, you know, Dan, it is Christmas. So I felt corrected. So I thought what I would do is read a short section about this I have the hardest time, and in the book I had the hardest time talking about what I mean by impudence, because it sounds like insult, and I don't mean it to. So let me just read that part, and then I'll go on to something else. It's all short. I think it's short. We'll find out. 190 to 195. Here we go. When backgammon was a fad just after the Pleistocene era, I have to learn to pause. I wrote a magazine piece about it. A professional gambler was the champion then. Well, of course he was a professional gambler. He and maybe 20 or 30 others like him had made a round of tournaments whose first prizes were six figures. As I recall, the top prize for this tournament, one of the biggest, held in New York, was $250,000. I interviewed this guy for a few times, once in a very fancy gilt furniture, gilt mirror New York hotel suite. He was indeed tall, dark, and handsome, and was wearing a gold-colored robe closed with not so much a belt as a sash. He was affable but unrevealing. He wouldn't talk about his winnings. He wouldn't talk about cheaters. He wouldn't talk about mind games. He stuck with backgammon strategy and the wrinkle-free version of his life story. In the middle of the interview, a beautiful dark-haired woman walked out of the suite's bedroom wearing similarly boudoirish attire. The man looked very much the gambler, the woman very much the gambler's moll. But that, no rings on their matrimonial fingers, was just about as racy as things got. The interview was fine. Fine being one of the most damning words in our language. I wasn't getting what I needed, at least a glimpse or a quote about the darker side of the professional gambler's world. My deadline was approaching like the walls of a car crusher. My side view mirror had just snapped off. That's what it felt like. I went downstairs in the hotel and desperately sought out another top player, this one in the ballroom where the tournament was being held. He had just won his match and was sitting to the side, looking quite the aristocrat. Gray three-piece suit, neat white hair swept back from a smooth, noble dome, pearl cufflinks, a vaguely English accent like that of American movie actors in the 30s. He was similarly close to the vest. That cliche comes from gambling, of course, holding your cards close to the vest. And I tried to sidle up to questions about controversies, rule breaking, confrontations, and again, winnings. No dice, so to speak. Finally, in exasperation, and as not so much a Hail Mary as a farewell Mary, I asked a question that I knew was out of bounds for any gambler. I said, what's the most money you've ever bet on a single game of backgammon? What? He said, I can't believe you've asked that question. I said, I thought I would give it a try. At this point, unlike everyone else in this room, I have nothing to lose. Well, he said, you've got a nerve on you, I must say. What impudence. You know we don't speak about such things. He turned away from me. I said to myself, I'll have to try to make a meal of the pablum that I already have been served. The man I now thought of as Douglas Fairbanks turned back to me and said, I will tell you this. There was a distant gleam in his eye. It was for more money than is at stake in this entire tournament. One game, I said. One game, young man, he said. Did you win? I asked. Of course I won, he said. And then, with his own impudence, do you think I'd mention it if I hadn't? And then he told me much more on the condition of his remaining anonymous and unidentifiable, though the description that I just gave you of him is as accurate as my memory allows. Impudence, as I define it here, has less to do with shamelessness, its Latin-derived meaning, than with conversational nerve, one of the words the gambler actually used about me. It has to do with speaking up with what you want to say but are afraid might be taken amiss. It has to be governed very carefully, and it is not welcome in serious business transactions or other negotiations that have agendas or goals. As I should know, since along with other traits of my own, it probably led to my final decision to decorporatize. You have to have nerve and the confidence of that nerve to be really good in conversation, I think. You have to be pure of heart, though. That is, you have to know that the nervy remarks you make and the questions you ask proceed from a kind of momentarily restored childlike frankness and inquisitiveness, rather than adult snoopiness or prurience. As David Hume said back in the 18th century, and I will admit back in the second chapter of this book, much earlier on, he said, "Nothing carries a man through the world like a true, genuine, natural impudence." And you have to be able to judge well the person you're talking to in terms of playfulness and resilience. When I was interviewing the brilliant singer-songwriter Nico Case, she was describing the small Vermont town she was moving to, leaving Tucson. I mentioned a book of photographs I'd seen about hunters in Vermont's North Country, heavy men with beards and rifles, surrounded by mounted antlers in their hunting lodges. "I love beards," she said. "Mutton chops are the best." I said somewhat impudently, "Well, I'm sorry, but that means you have to love Ulysses S. Grant." She said with surprising passion, "Ulysses S. Grant was the hottest." I had my quote, but I pushed on. "But he was so portly," I said. "I don't see the two of you together." She said, "Portly is really hot, too." The best opportunity for using impudence effectively is the dropped handkerchief, which bears a close resemblance to those quiet asides that invite curiosity, which I've talked about earlier. People drop handkerchiefs in conversation all the time, even if they aren't aware that they do, and even if they don't expect them to be picked up and returned with a wink. You can always break down formality, your own and that of the other people you're talking to, with a well-chosen bit of nerve. If someone says to you, after a long exchange, "My husband and I disagree about this," you have probably been invited to imputize something like, "And nothing else? Amazing." If someone says to you in the middle of a narrative, "But as usual, I had slept very well the night before," you can, if you're an insomniac, pick it up later and say, "By the way, do you know how annoying that bit about sleeping well was?" Young people are especially reluctant to be curious or mischievous with older people. And for the most part, this respectfulness suits them well, but not always. I found that older, well-set conservative types often enjoy being surprised by a little nerve, unexpected questions from younger people. It allows them to come down from the perch of convention where they usually have to sit. On the other hand, impudence can, of course, end a connection with an elder or a superior instead of continuing or deepening it. So you always have to be careful. I know the Clinton School is dedicated to public service, and I've learned a great deal about it, and the field work that is done here. This is the first time I've actually understood the word practicum. You all know what that means? I would say it, but I often said it and had no idea what it meant. I'd say, "Well, have you done your practicum yet?" And my daughter would say, "Yes, I've done my practicum," and we'd leave the conversation. But in the work that, for instance, the Clinton School does, and in political negotiations and in field work and so on, the communications that happen are often not what I would call true conversations because they involve goals and agendas. I assume that friendships do arise from that kind of work, as they do in universities with professors and students and so on. But But then they become independent of often somewhat more independent of the work at hand. So what are the rewards and benefits of what I call here aimless conversations, and conversations that are not aimed at achieving something practical? Well, one thing you may not know is that after you have a good conversation, if you're like me, you have a kind of good feeling. You feel not high, but slightly exhilarated and restored. And there's a physiological reason for that. Good conversation, like a touch and several other biological functions, releases oxytocin in the brain. Oxytocin is called the trust hormone. It's released during breastfeeding. It's released when people touch each other. It's released during orgasm. It's released during childbirth. This is a kind of hormone that works on the neurology of the brain to enhance a feeling of connectedness. And that is precisely what happens when you have a good 1-hour conversation with someone, especially maybe someone you don't know so well, and you get up from the table or from the bar or from wherever it is, and you feel good. Well, it's not only conscious, it's also physiological. There's a necessity for that, or at least there's a benefit for that kind of thing. I'm going to read a little bit more about that, and then maybe a little after that, and then wrap it up. If you sit down with someone and have a good talk, your sense of well-being afterward has not only a conscious component, but a neurochemical one as well. The one proceeds from the other. It is a high, in quotes, and one that, like other highs, is habit-forming, but in a good way, in an unusually good way. You would like to have more of it. You want more of it, especially with those who are good at it, which means that these others release in you that physiological reaction of feeling better, feeling good. And I have to go on a little bit more. We can enrich and elevate our individual lives by understanding the great rewards of good conversations, deliberately seeking them out, getting better at them. You don't need to be a neurobiologist or know anything about oxytocin to have these rewards. Human consciousness, which is an utterly unique and I believe forever inexplicable phenomenon, confers upon us not only the blessing of intelligence, but the curse of loneliness. That is, we alone as a species are aware that we are walled up inside our own minds, cut off from others by the very fact that we are aware. A bacterium or a barn owl may be able to be sad or happy or lonely, but you can bet that it doesn't know that it is. One of the few ways to climb the wall between us or speak through a chink in it is to talk together. Although conversation is a reciprocally generous behavior, it ultimately serves the self, as experiments with autistic people show in a clinical setting. There's a reference to something earlier in the book in which, with children and even older people with autism, oxytocin was sprayed as a nasal spray into the subjects. And these autistic people did much better afterward on things like facial recognition. They could recognize emotions more, and they knew better what their remarks would produce. And the guy who did this experiment is I think the brother or cousin of Borat, the guy. I know, it's very weird. One brother specializes in confusing everyone, and the other is an eminent psychologist who tries to bring people together. And if you want to Google that, you'll find this test, and you can take the test. It's called the mind reading the eyes test. It's all you have to put in, mind reading the eyes. You'll see 36 faces, and under each face and expression, there are 4 choices as to what emotion is being shown. And I think a normal score was in the normal, I was just barely in the normal range. That's all I have to say. So how I get off writing this book, I have no idea. My daughter, I think there were 42 questions. I got 32. I think normal was about 30. I'm probably lying. It was probably 31. My daughter got like 37. She wants to be a social worker, so I guess it makes sense. Where was I? Let's see. I was talking about, and finding out when we're talking with other people, and finding out who the person is we're talking to, what his or her complaints and complexities are, his or her tastes, toxins, his or her angels and demons. We also find out who we are, especially if the other person returns the courtesy of attention and has the curiosity and humor and, yes, impudence to draw us out in knowing others and allowing ourselves to be known. We know ourselves. Most good conversations seem to me to address, sometimes way below the surface, sometimes floating right on the top, like a fly in the ointment of existence, what I call the great insecurity. That is, most conversations, one way or another, on the top or on the bottom, invoke admissions of feelings of inadequacy, confessions of some mistakes, even in a jocular way, the partial fraudulence involved in acting like an adult when we know on the inside that we still feel very much like children. If we don't admit our weaknesses to ourselves and to others under careful circumstances, if we don't admit our weaknesses, we run the danger of losing our strengths. These reflections are the meat and potatoes of psychotherapy and analysis, and of true friendship, of making existential and even pragmatic use of this self-knowledge. If you'll just let your mind and memory muse and reflect a little, you will, like a dowser for water, almost always find a deep theme or two running like an underground river below the whole encounter. All really good conversations include, overtly or silently, the mutual understanding that our lives are mysterious and also often difficult. And that's why we turn to each other and talk to each other, so as to feel less alone in those difficulties and in that mystery. Another reason I wrote this book is the feeling that electronic communications are, if you're in a car crash and you have GPS and OnStar, that's good. And no one's arguing, and I don't think anybody would be so foolish as to say that the digital world hasn't brought enormous benefits and comforts and security and knowledge to us. But I think it also poses a tremendous danger. And there's an interesting book called The Shallows by Nicholas Carr about what electronic communication does neurologically to our brains. But I think none of us need to be scientists to know that when we're in a restaurant and we see two people at dinner, both of them on electronic devices, that's at the very least surprising, or, well, maybe not surprising anymore, but there's a visceral reaction that something is in danger here, that people who give all their times to their electronica are missing out on social interactions that are important. But more than that, more than individually, I think we live in a world now that is under such danger, internationally, terrorism, nuclear weapons, environmental degradation, all those things that I worry that the erosion of personal conversation poses a threat to solving some of our problems, because we're now a global community and we need to talk to each other. And much as I like and use email and all the other devices that you might think, I still think that when I sit down and talk to someone, there's something very special about it. So I just read a little bit more, and then I'll stop and then I'll see if there are any questions. Thinking about conversations you've had can prove useful in two ways. One way, as I just discussed, is figuring out what makes you yourself tick, and then possibly winding or rewinding or unwinding yourself to a new place. The other is far more woo-woo and embraces no less than humanity in its entirety. Since a good conversation always involves finding common ground, it means that differences will have to retire to the sidelines, at least for a time. We live in an era when it's not just a good idea to try to get along, but with the apocalyptic weaponry we have developed and the environmental havoc we are wreaking on our planet and the ever smaller world of the internet age, it is imperative. Barack Obama ran an important part of his campaign on the premise of and promise of talking to people with whom we have differences. He said he would, for instance, talk to Iranians, whereas President Bush had refused to do so. It is kind of hard to punch someone in the stomach or fire an RPG at him or burn his house down while you're talking to him. In the New York Times last year, the Israeli filmmaker Ari Folman, who produced and directed the award-winning animated movie Waltz with Bashir, spoke about his experiences during the war in Lebanon. The film was about his experiences during the war in Lebanon and the massacre at Shatila. He had the following ultra-pithy exchange with interviewer Deborah Solomon. Question: do you find that talk is effective in war and in diplomacy? Answer: yes. Talk. Don't shoot. Talk. There's one war that can't be avoided, however, and that's the war within our own natures, between aggression and territoriality on the one hand, reproductive supremacy, the gathering of power, the amassing of wealth, clan loyalties, all those things that served us so well evolutionarily for so long and led to the propagation of our species, they're now coming back to haunt us. They are not what we need. The other part of human nature is the altruistic part, compassion, empathy, and so on. So there's a war going on in the world and within ourselves constantly about which is to have the upper hand. And I maintain that if we continue to allow the ancient evolutionary drives to drive us, we are going to be in serious trouble. We need to modulate them and moderate them. This is a conflict that many scientists and philosophers and statesmen have come to understand as the most important one being fought right now. For my part, I fear that our better natures are going to lose. I fear that the ancient evolutionary commands of survival, genetic propagation, will not give way broadly or quickly enough, if they ever could, to more cooperative motives and instincts. Too much stands in the way, a large part of that much being religious fanaticism, abetted often by extreme nationalism and dire poverty. It's tempting to deplore not just religious fanaticism, but religion as a whole, as Christopher Hitchens has done with such power and eloquence in his book, God is Not Great. Because, as we've seen, most ordinary people agree that religion has a conversational cordon around it, even thicker than the one that surrounds politics, with signs saying, do not enter here, for people who don't know one another well, especially. The reason is that the subject is beyond reason. You can't really talk about something that by definition is a matter of faith and irrationality. That would be fine if only there were more even-handedness, a confinement, as well as an exclusion in this conversational taboo. That is, if you must worship God, this God or that God, no one should be allowed to encroach on your right to do so. But correspondingly, you must never use your faith in the service of political or social purposes. far better would be to admit religion into the open arena of conversation. I believe if we did that, if we were bold enough about it, even religious people would eventually have to concede that either we will have to learn to get along together and achieve common goals on our own without the help of any divinity, or humankind will perish. The faithful can retroactively attribute progress in these areas, and maybe correctly, to a Godhead or a God elbow or whatever. But the victory over our more combative instincts, which now serve us so badly after millennia of serviceably seeing to our survival and increase, that will come from our own heads and our own hearts. Our own actions will determine our future, and for a good future, prominent if not preeminent among those actions must be talking to one another, conversation. I want to talk just for one more moment about a little bit more about technology, and that seemed to me to be both a curse and a blessing, and then I promise I'll stop. We've come up with the technological means to map our own genome, to destroy everybody, to create babies in all manner of surrogate and cloning ways, to give us lettuce that will be unaffected by temperatures from absolute 0 to Fahrenheit 452, that will play a Beethoven string quartet or Peggy Sue as it is being picked, and soon to give us much, much longer lives, if not eternal ones. As ethicists throughout the world have said, starting back when the atomic bomb was made, we have reached the point in our scientific development where it isn't just a good idea, but crucial for us to impose moral and social control over the forces we've unleashed with our minds, before those forces control and destroy us. Like capitalism, technology tends to become a sort of being, a blind, thoughtless entity that has its own way of taking over our lives. I should add, like totally laissez-faire capitalism, about which there's an earlier section. Capitalism drives communications technology in two ways: in the profits that are made from it, iPods, weapons, pharmaceuticals, and in the tendency of these products to make us work longer and harder. A corporation is a legal person, don't forget that. But when left unregulated and unsupervised, it's ultimately sociopathic. It's a tyrant. It tears families apart, it dehumanizes those who serve it, and it tries to permit only the lowest possible wages for most of its minions. Money may talk, but it doesn't want us to, or at least not about anything but it. We cannot go on serving these demons of our own devising if we don't rein in these marvels that have turned into menaces, and if we don't manage to make communal and cooperative motives and sustainable goals supersede the impossible grails of endless growth and ever greater profits, and if we don't tear down or at least sequester the empty virtual babble that our society threatens to become, we're finished. Thank you.
We do have time for some questions. If you raise your hand, we'll get a microphone to you in the back, right there, Pat.
Hi, I'm Jessica Rice. I'm a student at the Clinton School, and we want to thank you for being here. You talked a lot about how good conversation is less prevalent in a society where we really need it most. Can you talk about some specific examples or avenues that we could seek out mediums to have conversations and how to initiate those conversations as young people?
Well, I think it's, I've been, since I wrote the book, I've realized that we have that in terms of our environment. We have national parks. We have the idea of conservation, which has the same letters as conversation, as it turns out. I think it has, first of all, I think it has to be, especially for young people who are very wedded to their devices, I think it has to be a conscious effort. And I don't know that we can set aside you know, Yosemite National Cafe for people to meet in and have conversations. I think really, you know, George Orwell wrote a piece about a famous essay about Charles Dickens in which he made sort of fun of Dickens's overall idea that change for moral good happens within each individual. But I think, and then at the end of the essay, he says, actually, he's right. It has to be that way. So I think that for people who are worried or would like to have better conversations, I think it's an actual effort of will at first, and then it becomes a matter of habit. And it's like making room for anything else. And it's sad to say because, you know, now we have exercise regimes. We used to be farmers, but we don't have that physical exercise anymore, so now we have gyms instead of farms. And similarly, conversation used to be natural. There was no television. And in small towns, there were people whittling sticks and talking to each other, and that was a major form of recreation. So I think it's a kind of almost preservationist attitude that you have to have, and I think you can do it anywhere. You don't need a special place. The only place you need is inside yourself and the people you want to talk to. So no, I don't have any specific locales for you to go to. I wish there were such things. Yes,
Right
I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's coming. Come on, Bill. Up front. Yep.
Your talk, first of all, makes me think of two of my favorite lines from movies. One is Steve Martin movie L.A. Story. He's at brunch with some people. He turns to a woman, says, I heard you took a course in conversation. And she responds, yes. And then the other, of course, is the famous line that Olympia Dukakis and Steel Magnolias, if you don't have anything good to say about someone, come sit by me. Which leads into my question. In conversation, when someone says something nasty or rude, or maybe the idea of conflict in conversation, you touched on it in politics and religion, you know, when those happen, you know, you kind of, a couple of beats later, think of what you should have said or could have said. And so what do we do to get better at that? Do we watch more stand-up comics and learn to be faster on our feet and learn more humor, or what?
Well, first of all, I think that kind of shocked and inarticulate reaction that we have when someone is rude or insulting is appropriate. I think it actually is the right reaction. If you're fast on your feet and have a witty remark to make, then you're sort of, in a funny way, implicitly condoning what has just been said. But I think, depending on the level of the insult or the rudeness, if it's something that morally you simply cannot abide, you must say so. And not make a joke, but just say, I find that very offensive. And probably end the conversation. If it's of a more minor sort, if someone, for instance, in the book I talk about going to lunch with someone and impulsively beginning to disparage a former colleague of mine at the New Yorker and felt a cool sort of cloud descending. And I looked up and I said to my companion, she's probably your best friend, isn't she? She said, yes. I said, how do I recover from this? And she was very gracious. She was the one, I mean, it's very, the answer to your question is either respond, if it's very severe, you must respond. You must kind of end the conversation. If someone insults someone very close to you, even unwittingly, it probably you don't want to be their friend anyway, so you're not going to lose anything. But if it's a slighter remark, you know, if it annoys you or if it offends you in some way, I think a kind of, you know, just a kind of non-response speaks volumes to the person who said it. And you may not want to, you may find a convenient way then to end the conversation. But one of the reasons that insults and rude remarks are insults and rude remarks is that they actually almost destroy conversations. That's why they're rude. I mean, that's precisely why they're rude. And if you want to get to the level of speaking hard truths about other people or about yourself, you have to make sure that the person you're talking to is on the same wavelength that you're on. If you don't know someone very well, it is an unsocialized person who will take that kind of chance.
Right here. One second, one second, one second, one second.
I was wondering what you felt the role of storytelling is in a conversation. It seems so one-sided sometimes, but does it have a purpose?
Wonderful question. I think we all know people who I kind of have a rule of thumb in dinner party conversations, cocktail party conversations, or places where people meet each other perhaps for the first time or just getting to know each other. 5 minutes. 5 minutes. You can actually time it. I've done it again and again. If someone goes on for longer than 5 minutes, they're not being mindful of the exchange. Now, I know a man named Simon Winchester, a great writer who's written The Professor and the Madman and other bestsellers, and I could listen to him all day. I don't mind if he talks forever. And I think several of us, we all know several storytellers who are enchanting. And I think what happens then, what Simon does, which is so effective, is after about 5 minutes, he'll say, am I boring anyone? We can stop. And everybody says, sincerely, go on. No, go on. We want to know the end of it. I think that's the 5-minute rule is a good one, and everybody ought to abide by it in a casual conversation. But if someone that you know well or don't know well is telling something suspenseful, I think one reaction to it, if they're worried that they're going on too long, is to encourage them to continue and actually interrupt them and say, this is fascinating. I hope we'll get to the end of it. Eventually. And then also, if you want to tell a story, and it's of a certain length, it seems to me it's a very good idea to ask the people you're talking to from time to time if it's okay. And if someone's really boring you with a story, I'm very much for interruptions under those circumstances. I think it's a courtesy, sometimes even to the person himself who can't stop, to take a certain part of what's happened and and try to steer away from what seems to be an endless story. It can be done. It takes a certain kind of skill. You say, wait a minute, let's go, that's interesting, but can we talk a little bit more about such and such? Because my sister also wore bananas in her hat, just like the person you're talking about. And then it's like taking the stream and diverting it a little bit.
Right there. We'll do 1, 2 right there. You're both right there.
My husband and I drove to Tennessee recently. We had an 8-hour road trip, and instead of conversing on the way, we read your book aloud to each other in the car. And I noticed that a lot of the people in your book are people who don't know each other or don't know each other well. And I wondered what your view is of conversations between people who live together.
Where's my wife? Well, I'm glad I'm not your husband, but only for that reason. Because if I were to read aloud from the book, I would throw up, basically, in a car. So I'm glad neither of you gets car sick. And I hope neither of you is driving while you're reading. You didn't really make that clear. There's a wonderful writer for the New Yorker named Peter DeVries. He was married to a woman, actually they weren't married, but they had 2 or 3 children. They lived together their whole lives, but they never got married. They didn't believe in the institution. But they acted like them and were essentially a married couple. And she was a wonderful writer too. Her name was Katinka Loeser, Loeser, and wrote one of the best books of short stories that I've ever read and that nobody knows about, called 1,000 Pardons. She wrote stories based on her long relationship with her husband. Don't worry, I'm getting there. It won't be 5 minutes. And one of the stories was about dinner. They had dinner together. And they were in their 60s. And there was a couple nearby, similarly in their 60s, obviously married, having an animated conversation. Whereas the writer and her husband were largely silent. And they sort of kept on realizing that the couple next door was having the most animated, cheerful conversation. So obviously a little uncomfortable. And they get up, they leave. Gladstone, which is the husband's fictional name, turns back, sort of gestures at the other couple and says, "Putting on airs." I do think the excitement and novelty of courtship it brings forth tremendous conversational exchanges, but I think after a while, in most relationships, if they're good, probably that amount of conversation subsides necessarily, partly because you're busy, partly because you know what the other person's going to say, and you don't necessarily need to hear it. But there's a deeper bond. I remember the Waltons as an ideal sort of, I don't know how many people remember that television show, but the father and mother had a very interestingly, I think, over-idealized, but nevertheless emulable relationship. They didn't talk much to each other, but they talked the truth when they did talk, and they talked candidly. And I think that's the great advantage of a partnership like that, which is that's why a husband cannot be called on to testify against his wife, and vice versa, because it's a relationship that affords that kind of, and that's the kind of exchange. Now, I think your reading to each other was brilliant, because there is a conversation going on, even when you're just reading to each other. And then also, at the end, you have something to talk about.
There's one right behind you, Pat.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I look forward to reading your book, definitely. I've been working for the past 4 years in India for a conflict transformation company where we promoted dialogue and facilitation. And I found the biggest challenge in promoting this work, it was very challenging, it was people's skepticism towards having conversations and fear. So I have two questions. One, how do you think we can get over that skepticism towards having good conversations, difficult conversations? And what do you think is the biggest barrier, what do you think is the biggest challenge or barrier to using dialogue for international disputes? Because it seems that although we want to promote it, it doesn't happen enough.
What was the skepticism? What was the basis of the skepticism? Why were people skeptical? Because it took up time?
No, I think people were just scared and just felt that it wouldn't work. Just having conversations won't really solve the problem.
I think probably the conversations that I'm talking about tend not to solve problems directly. So I think they're right about that. They're not practical, they're not pragmatic. But I think what they do is allow problems to be solved later on. And speaking of international diplomacy, as I was saying, and I think in an interview today, time after time you'll find that those conferences that do work, and maybe Roosevelt and who met at Yalta? Roosevelt, Stalin, and Churchill, I think. You find eyewitness descriptions of people taking to each other not outside of the issues. Either they do or they don't. And I think so often what happens is, if that kind of bond can't be established, a personal bond, then the negotiation is going to break down because the issues are too divisive. If it's possible, every now and then you see a kind of chemistry between two leaders, and you know that there's a better chance that whatever issue is at hand will be resolved. But that's just a matter of, that's so importantly a matter of personality. But I think if leaders were better schooled in the idea of trying to make a psychological connection with the people that they're talking to, maybe more issues would be solved. And how to do that, I will leave to the Clinton School for Public Service.
We have time for one more, right there.
Thank you so much. I've enjoyed the conversation tonight, the dialogue. The gentleman's question here, at risking sounding impudent a bit, In your talk, you suggested that in all conversation, there is this overt and somewhat clandestine desire to speak of the mysteries of our life and the difficulties. And in a political or religious tension, sometimes we do unwittingly insult someone or unconsciously insult someone. I believe conversation is inherently a reach for communion. So having said that, how do you suggest we, in the space of an insult, whether it's unwitting or unconscious or not, reach for the underlying tension or the underlying desire to commune or to collaborate or to converse in the space of someone we find as our enemy?
I'm glad we've come back to the question of insult, or inadvertent or otherwise. One part of the book does talk about insults, and very often in social circumstances, when we're insulted, it's by someone who doesn't know how to comport himself or herself, and doesn't have the skill to avoid that kind of thing. But you should listen to the insult, because sometimes people who don't know those rules will tell you a truth that you don't want to hear. And if someone, and I've had that happen 2 or 3 times, again, it's in the book, people have said something to me that I really was offended by. And then as days went by, I would go back to it, partly because I was nursing a grudge. And I'd have to admit, little by little, that there was merit in what this person said. So the kind of people who break the social contract like that, just on a social basis, may be telling you something that you ought to think about. And so you should take it seriously. I think the other thing that I forgot to say to this gentleman who asked basically much the same question, but in matters of social interchange and possibly political and diplomatic interchange and religious exchange and so on, I think that if you have the maturity and wisdom to understand that that person would probably, if he or she were at their best, not have chosen to insult you, and to try to become the sort of, not exactly forgiver, but the understander of what might lead someone to be rude or to insult you, short of an abrasive, confrontational insult. I think you need to kind of master the situation and try to save it, especially if it's an official business and you're trying to accomplish something. It's not fair. It calls for a great amount of maturity on the part of the person who has been hurt. But I think it's necessary. And you can actually help the other person if you're smart and good-hearted enough to let them know that they've sort of broken a rule, but without making them feel terrible about it. Maybe they'll learn something. So I think the receiver of offense, in a way, Jesus tells us, turn the other cheek. And I think there's a lot it's not just hit me again, it's like it has to do with not reacting angrily or violently if someone pushes you, but to sort of accept it and try to eventually make use of it. And I think his teachings were very important in terms of communication. There's a lot in the Bible, especially in the New Testament, about how you respond to people who offend you.
Let's thank Dan for that great conversation.